Hello, and thank you for joining us. It's now at past. We're going to wait just another moment or so for the last few people to join, and we'll be getting started in about a minute. Thanks so much. Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. This is Jessica Kirk and you're here for the Siegel & Gale webinar on naming architecture, a blueprint for portfolio simplicity. I'm joined today by Jeff Lapatine, and he's going to be speaking most of the presentation about naming and architecture. After 30 years at Siegel & Gale, he has worked in every industry, working primarily in naming and brand architecture, and we're delighted to have him here with us today. We're going to just take you through a little bit about Siegel & Gale to set the context, and then I'll be turning it over to Jeff. So here at Siegel & Gale, we're known as the Simplicity Company. We're a global strategic branding firm, and we work in these various disciplines. Specifically, today we'll be talking about naming and brand architecture. We are more than 45 years in business and headquartered here in New York, where we're calling from you, where we are today. Every year for the last 5 years, we've done a study that we call the Global Brand Simplicity Index, in which we measure brands and their simplicity. And you can find out more about that at the GBSI's website, simplicityindex.com, where we encourage you to look up brands that you know and brands that you admire and see how they've been faring in the studies. Let me turn it to the next slide here. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to kick us off. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to speak about what I'm calling naming architecture. I believe we're all familiar with the term brand architecture. Well, naming architecture is related, a cousin if you would, but not exactly the same as what we usually think of as brand architecture. And I believe the distinction is interesting and important, and that's why it's the subject of today's discussion. I'm going to talk about these distinctions between the types of architectures, some of the basic elements of a naming architecture assignment, and finish with some case studies that illustrate these points. Here you see the quote by Steve Jobs, certainly a proponent of simplicity, as is our firm, Siegel & Gale. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about naming architecture, it's about bringing simplicity to a complex product or service portfolio. So what is it? And how does it lead to portfolio simplicity? The way that I define naming architecture is it's how an entity organizes and guides the naming of its capabilities and offerings so that customers and others can readily understand and navigate what's being offered. It may involve creating some new names, but in fact it's usually the opposite. It generally involves reducing the number of proprietary names in a portfolio. So it's about creating consistent naming hierarchies and constructs rather than creating specific new names. I might also add that an assignment may have elements of a brand architecture assignment and a naming architecture assignment, as well as creating new names. That's not unusual. But it's important to think about when we're talking about the architecture. It's not about creating the specific names, but it's about creating the construct for how we deal with the portfolio. As I was saying, it's often referred to, but it isn't exactly the same as brand architecture. I think many of us are familiar with the diagram that we see on this page where we talk about branded houses, house of brands, and hybrids, or some variation of this. And it's certainly related to what we're talking to today. But we're not primarily talking about the relationship of the master brand or a parent brand to a portfolio and how we use sub-brands. Instead, we're really focusing on the names in a portfolio and how we can make them simpler and easier to understand. On this slide, I point to the CVS Health brand architecture that Siegel & Gale has been working on, because this is an example, and when we look at this page, it's an example of brand architecture. The new parent company, CVS Health, is going to be at the top of various businesses, including CVS Pharmacy, CVS Caremark, CVS Minute Clinic, and CVS Specialty. And it's really the relationship of these sub-brands or businesses to the CVS Health that is the primary focus of the brand architecture assignment. But on this next page, naming architecture really deals with the types of names that work best in this portfolio. So we do look at the names underneath these business units, but we're looking at this myriad of different types of names, identities too, but we're not primarily looking at the graphic identity when we're talking about naming architecture. But how can we simplify this portfolio and rationalize the system as a whole so people understand what CVS Health is about and how they can find the products and services within each of these business units. This distinction is particularly important in defining and scoping a branding assignment. I'm pointing to an article here that I recently wrote for Marketing Props, talking about different types of architectures, and when hiring a firm to help with a architecture assignment, what is the company really looking for? Are they looking for brand architecture? Are they looking for naming architecture? Are they looking for visual architecture? Because these have very different implications on staffing, cost, timelines, focus, and the like. So naming, if the assignment is really about naming architecture, it's good that the parties are on the same wavelength as to what is going to be delivered and what the client can expect. Naming architecture, as I mentioned, is related to visual identity, but it's not the primary focus. So when Siegel & Gale worked on the Aetna assignment several years back, we did create a new logo. We looked at how this logo would be applied across the portfolio, but that was not the primary focus of the portfolio, the naming architecture assignment, which was also very much part of our commitment. And lastly, it's not about business organization. But honestly, when you're looking at how the portfolios are structured, it could have some impact on structure going forward. So when is naming architecture typically needed? Well, a new combined entity has new offerings that they need to communicate in the marketplace. So how do you rationalize these in terms of where they fit within the company, and how do we make them simple and consistent for customers and prospects to understand? An existing entity may lack naming conventions and procedures, or they may have become inconsistent over time. This is often the case. Probably very many assignments fall into this bucket, where the company has expanded, has grown, the product portfolios have grown, but there are really no consistent conventions and procedures to make things look the same across the company. Or the third instance, where the portfolio has become so burdened with proprietary brand names and trademarks that it's difficult to understand, complex to navigate, and expensive to maintain. So this relates back to a previous slide where I said it's not always about creating new names. Sometimes it's about eliminating names that have developed over time. There are 4 elements of a naming architecture, and I'll go through each of these. At least there are 4 that I'm defining today. The first element is portfolio modeling, and I'll talk about this on the next page. There's name selection criteria. There's naming frameworks, which may be a term that's not as familiar to everybody on this call. And lastly, there's internal guidance and governance and guidelines and the like. So let's go through each of these one at a time. Portfolio modeling. What does this mean? Well, you start by mapping and analyzing the current portfolio names as a starting point. And then we look to alternative models for structuring the portfolio to decide where different types of names fit. Name selection criteria. This is not developing the names themselves, but determining the criteria that helps the company select the right types of names for the range of offerings within a portfolio. Do you need a proprietary name? Do you need a trademark? Can you get by with descriptive names? When do you use one versus the other? How do you extend? How do you talk about new versions? So what's the criteria for deciding what's going to be this new name that you add to the portfolio, or taking a fresh look at the portfolio and trying to simplify it? There are basically four types of names, in the world of trademarks. There are generic names, descriptive names, suggestive names, and arbitrary names. And these definitions tend to change, or they tend to be modified from time to time, depending on who's using it. But generally, when you're talking to attorneys, these are the four areas. Naturally, a generic name is not protectable. It's how you refer to something generally, a mobile phone, for instance. A descriptive name can be owned. It may not be considered a very strong trademark because it's not highly distinctive, but it is ownable, like AT&T Wireless or DMV Data Exchange. Not the most inventive names. What they lack in inventiveness, they gain in clarity. But there's the issue of how distinctive in the marketplace do you want this name to be. Suggestive names, which is an area where a lot of energy is usually put when developing names, are using recognizable words, real words, combinations of words to evoke a benefit or an attitude or convey some attribute. So Sprint, for instance, is a suggestive name because it speaks to speed. SmartBook naturally speaks to intelligence. Navigator speaks to the ability to navigate a portfolio. And lastly, the last column, arbitrary names, or sometimes called fanciful names. They're invented. They may not mean very much. There may be a kernel of meaning in the names, but that's not the primary purpose. Names like Kodak, Verizon, less of an emphasis on what they want to communicate about something in the portfolio or the company itself, and more just trying to create some distinctiveness in the marketplace. So when we talk about developing naming criteria, we're trying to determine where is a name going to fit within this spectrum. To amplify this a bit, I touched upon this, but the more you move to the left side of the spectrum, harder to trademark, less distinctiveness. The more you move to the right side, easier to trademark, but maybe not as meaningful. This slide, from the USPTO database, just indicates that when you're creating a name that's not a descriptive name, it may seem very energetic. It may seem, very attractive at first. Take the word navigator. But when you look more closely, there are almost 1,700 navigators across all classes in the trademark database, registered trademarks in the U.S. Doesn't mean they're all in the same class for each company, but a name that seemingly seems that it's going to separate something in the marketplace just may not. The energy or the excitement may be better placed around the descriptive name than necessarily always looking for something that feels less descriptive. The third element that I'm going to talk about, and this is the one I said that might be new to the thinking around naming architecture, are naming frameworks. And that's when we look at a name both, I'll say vertically and horizontally, not in terms of market placement, but looking at where the name fits in relationship to other brands or names in the hierarchy, and also looking at the names horizontally. How do you construct a name so that it creates greater clarity and consistency? I'll get into this in a minute so it'll become a little bit clearer. There are two parts to the framework. As I said, if you look at this vertically, you may have a suite, you may have the product itself, you may have a module to the product, you may have an extension. So you're looking at, where does this particular element fall in that level, and how are the products positioned in relationship to each other. The second element of the framework, though, is the naming construct. And you tend to look at this more horizontally. What are the elements that make up the name? Does it have the master brand? Does it have a proprietary product name? Do we add a descriptor behind it? Do we have an acronym that's either the full name or something that amplifies the product name? And do we talk about the audience at the end of the name? So this is a construct that we worked on for one client, that tried to take all the elements of a name and create some consistency to how names are developed and used throughout the organization. And the fourth element that I'll talk about is internal guidance. Now this slide, when you look at it, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but everybody wants decision trees that are going to guide naming decisions. So this one, do you need a new name? No, you don't. You don't get a new name. Good, simple decision tree if you want to really have control over the organization. But naturally, decision trees are much more thoughtful than this. They can deal with marketing spend, audience knowledge, many other factors that go into what kind of name is needed for a particular audience. And then how do you control the governance process so that it lasts over time and is applied throughout the organization and make it easy for people to use. So let me turn to a few case studies that demonstrate these four elements and typical situations and processes. When I talk to these case studies, I can say in almost all of them, there are other elements that we worked on for this company that may involve elements of brand architecture, positioning, design. But here I want to focus on the elements of the assignment for each of these clients that dealt with the naming architecture issue. First one, let's talk about portfolio modeling. And again, that's what we're talking about, creating a way of organizing, mapping and organizing offerings in a portfolio so that it makes the most sense to the marketplace. I'll point to Aetna again. This client, the challenge was to be clearer in the products that it was selling. It may not be clear from their current offering that Aetna was doing a lot more than selling health insurance policies, particularly in the new health insurance marketplace and with the advent of intelligent systems to reduce costs and increase effectiveness in providing health solutions. Aetna wanted to be perceived as more than just an insurance company and really a company that had great breadth in how it dealt with people's health. As I mentioned, there is a changing healthcare environment, globalization, retailization, digitization, cost containment. It requires that all the companies in the field take a new look at what we mean by health insurance or healthcare. Competitors were doing this, and against this backdrop, Aetna needed to really step forward and differentiate itself again. So our objective was to expand and clarify Aetna's traditional insurance and financial capabilities, talking about a range of offerings that it had now beyond insurance that dealt with wellness programs and tools, and the newer area of medical intelligence and care optimization. So how did we do this? Again, within the framework of naming architecture. We created a new naming architecture model for organizing and clearly representing our expanded capabilities and offerings. When we talk about mapping, here's the starting point. You can see how diverse, and this is just a snapshot of the many different products that Aetna has. Some of them show disparity in how they dealt with them visually or how they dealt in master branding or not, the products, but also you can see in the context of the names themselves. There are proprietary names, there are descriptive names, there are different ways of dealing with subsidiary naming, ways of dealing with descriptors, and when the fact that this was not really very well organized within the company as a whole, and products look different from each part of the organization, this is where the portfolio got very complex. So what we did is we explored 4 different models, and what we see here is each one of these models, if you look at them vertically, covered the same 4 areas of interest that we wanted Aetna to emphasize. The first one on the left side, the most descriptive, is naturally they offer insurance plans and benefits, they have health and wellness programs, they have technology and intelligence, and they provide consulting and administration. And then we looked at different terminology in the different 4 buckets to see is there a different way of describing this that would communicate better in the marketplace. We followed this up with a bit of research where we looked at the different models and we showed them to target groups to see, what resonated best in getting a full picture of what Aetna represents today and what it will represent tomorrow. The criteria that we used for selecting an Aetna model, again, was the business objective, which one would tell the best news story. We had work sessions within the organizations, and we did validation research outside. And also, as it turns out, there were some regulatory restrictions on the wording that we could use. You could not overpromise the delivery of health as an insurance company. You could talk about striving to improve people's health, but you couldn't promise that you were going to actually improve people's health. So that's actually restricted some of the wording that we looked at. In the end, the one on the right was the one that seemed to resonate best, and both felt comfortable internally and externally. So now Aetna its overall portfolio of offerings fall into these 4 areas. There are products and services that deal with health plans and benefits, quality health plans and benefits. There are products and services and solutions that deal with healthier living. There are a few areas within Aetna that deal with financial, insurance, and pensions and the like, financial well-being, and again, this new area, which involves a lot of subsidiaries that they've acquired, as well as businesses that they've created that provide intelligent solutions to manage the cost of insurance and cost of healthcare, as well as bringing the hope of better health to people. I just went through this. I won't read through this page in detail again, but this is what the 4 organizing principles, the 4 models, if you would, represent. What was nice about Aetna, it's a little small, but if you look at the last paragraph, it becomes not only a way of organizing the products, but a way of marketing the Aetna story, to say that we are making it easier for you to live healthier, connecting you to quality health plans, healthier living, financial well-being, and intelligent solutions. So again, this is an example of one of the elements of naming architecture, where before you actually get into the construct of the name itself, how do you organize the names within a portfolio so that the company as a whole seems a lot clearer and easier to understand. It appears on their marketing materials. You can see that in the left-hand upper corner of their brochures. And the benefits to Aetna was, again, better understanding of its broader capabilities, a stronger competitive positioning in a changing marketplace, and really a rational integration of subsidiaries, acquisitions, and partnerships. So again, that was number 1, an example of portfolio modeling. 2 is name selection criteria, and I'm going to take you through a Motorola study. We've done a lot of work with Motorola in the last decade or so. Naturally, there are 2 different companies now. At the time of the study that I'm going to show you, they were one company with 2 very different kinds of portfolio products. The key challenge was that these product names and brands were getting obscured, customers were getting confused, resources were getting stretched. There was really not a rational or very effective distinction between what kind of names are most effective for the consumer phone marketplace versus the sophisticated enterprise business marketplace. The solution was to implement a company-wide product name selection process for connecting the right type of name to the right kind of offering. You could see a snapshot of the types of names that they were using. You know, you'll recognize a lot on the mobile device side. This was the era of Moto and Razor, and you had some of the other names as well, Moto Q and Pebble, and there was endless number of names that they were applying to mobile devices. But where it really started to get out of hand is that on the network and enterprise side, the leaders of these businesses started to apply that Moto convention and proprietary names to a range of network and enterprise products that probably didn't need to be named at all, given the audience that they were aimed at. So on the next slide, just to make this come to life, Moto was going wild. Moto was on everything that the company was doing. And we encouraged the company to keep Moto in, for some products, namely phones. You could see how effective this was in the global marketplace. But you had to be more discreet about using it on everything in the whole company. And you had to be more discreet about creating proprietary names for everything that was in the marketplace. So the first thing we did is we mapped the current situation as a blueprint for where we could go forward. And here you can see in that darker green area of this chart, we asked certain questions about, what kind of names will effectively help to position an offering to the consumer, business, government, or service provider marketplace, and how well do they seem to be doing it today. So we use this as a starting point to see, could we create a more rational system based on a decision tree that would enable them to name things in the future for greater clarity, consistency, and sustainability. So the criteria that we help create for creating new proprietary names is, don't attach an unclear, very proprietary name to an offering unless it's really game-changing. Otherwise, a descriptive name with the Motorola brand, very strong global brand, probably will work just as well. How much marketing support are you going to give it over time? If you're not going to market a proprietary name that isn't immediately clear, you're probably confusing the marketplace more than helping it. What's the substantial revenue potential of doing that? And lastly, can any existing sub-brand be used and successfully extended for this new offering rather than creating a new name for everything that comes down the line? And this was particularly the case when you looked at the phones that they were creating, where each new shape and each new feature ended up in a new proprietary name, rather than taking the Razor brand and extending this more rationally across a range of phones. Particularly on the enterprise and business side, this was even more true, that once a more sophisticated customer became familiar with the sub-brand, could you extend this effectively rather than creating a new brand that was essentially doing the same thing? Here's a snapshot of a decision tree that we created. Again, you see the 4 categories of generic, descriptive, suggestive, and arbitrary. We created criteria for when a name would be appropriate for each of these types of names. This is just a snapshot. Each one of these elements of the decision tree was amplified by a number of questions and criteria that would help people within the organization answer the questions effectively. But in the end, it moved the company to think more in terms of using existing names and creating versions around them. And if a new name was necessary, try to keep it on the descriptive side, and only create proprietary and really proprietary names when it met the criteria that I showed you on the previous page. What was interesting about this assignment too is we digitized this process so that business personnel within the Motorola organization didn't actually have to interpret and go through a decision tree, but we created an interactive tool that is essentially a decision tree. And by filling out this questionnaire, it does, at the end, provide an indication to the project leader what kind of name they should create. So the benefits of name selection criteria for Motorola was more focused marketing resources around key brands of the company, restricting the use of unnecessary new brand names, simplified use, again, through NameQuest to encourage consistent implementation, and a consistent mindset across the enterprise. This comes back to, again, that second element, what we're calling naming architecture, which is picking and enforcing the right name criteria. The third element, naming frameworks, and I think you may find this interesting. Again, we were talking about, the kind of the hierarchy of a name and the horizontal construction of a name. And you can see in the work that we did for Memorial Sloan Kettering that this came to life in the naming architecture that we helped them develop. They naturally, and they're doing it through some very effective advertising now, trying to maintain their leadership position in cancer care research and education. But again, their naming practices became very diverse, hard to navigate, hard to understand. So we developed these naming frameworks that would make things that they were doing throughout the organization, whether it was a type of research, a type of clinical care, a type of partnership, do a type of signage, show it in a way that made Memorial Sloan Kettering look, consistent and powerful, wherever it appeared. The building blocks for consistent naming constructs in this case was to take a look at all the different elements that they had to a name. Naturally, this is the formal parent name of Memorial Sloan Kettering, or MSK as they sometimes use. There are a lot of donor names. That's the reality of healthcare. There are specialty and subspecialty names. There are types of programs. There are capabilities. There are types of facilities. There are locations. So each of these, 7 elements, will combine in some form or another to identify some part of the organization. And again, whether it was a type of care that we were providing, a type of research, an actual building, an intention, a program, etc. So we tried to create consistent naming frameworks that would make this a lot more rational. We applied these to the definition. We created a definition set. What's a hospital? What's a center? What's a pavilion and a unit? Because particularly in healthcare, these get interchangeable. So when I think of the center, in some instances it means an area of research. In other instances, it means an actual building. And we provided the frameworks for how to use these more clearly and more consistently. Here's the first framework that you can see for facilities. So in each case, there's a name. There may be a donor name. There may be a specialty. There may be a type of service. There may be a capability, a facility, and a location. And you can see in the examples underneath that when we name buildings or centers or laboratories or locations, they fit within this horizontal construct of how do we consistently keep all these elements organized in a way that makes it easier for people to understand. This slide just demonstrates that it's being applied to many facilities that they're creating outside of the New York City area. So this is a cancer center, as you can see, and it fits the construct. So before they get to assign a solution, they have to step back and take a look at the naming construct to make sure that it's the right definition for the right kind of facility. Here's an example of how it's applied to internal units. What's a department? What's an office? How do we combine something to department or to the office of? So again, it looks a lot more consistent throughout the organization. The benefit of naming constructs to MSK, as intended, were improved clarity and consistency in applying medical terminology and helping patients and others to navigate the organization more effectively. The last element that I'm going to look at is internal guidance. And in this case, I'm going to take you through something that we did for Vanguard a few years back. The challenge was to help the company live up to the promise that they have of talking plainly. You can see it on the communications that they use, that plain talk is very much at the heart of the Vanguard brand. So they are taking an area, in this case investment, that may not be easy for consumers to understand, and they seek to provide clarity through the offerings that they have, through the products and services, to help people make the right investment decision. So we created guidelines and a government process to support this, this promise. This is the opening page to guidelines that we created. These were online for the organization to use, but they actually were printed as well. So you can see a little bit of the Vanguard personality and the way that it was shaped. But we answer such questions as what does the brand stand for? How does the naming strategy support what the brand stands for? What are the different types of names we should use? What types of names do you need, and how do you create names that support our values? So the following pages, just quickly, of a decision tree that we helped create for these guidelines that ask such questions as, do you really need a new name? Will a new proprietary name differentiate it from competitors? Will the return on brand justify the cost of creating a new proprietary name? And lastly, most importantly, this outside-in view, will customers actually benefit from what people within Vanguard think is necessary? Will investors have a better understanding if the name is descriptive, or will they have a better experience with the name if it's more proprietary? Going through the decision tree one step by another, it takes you to answer these questions. And as you can see, you get an evocative name if you, really, reach all the criteria that are set out in the decision tree. This last element of what we did to Vanguard deals with the actual process of creating names. Some of you may experience frustration in dealing with the legal requirements and regulatory requirements of a new name, and was there enough time to develop it? Were the right people consulted to develop the name internally? Was there enough time for management approval? So creating this matrix, if you would, this roadmap, is a way of making sure that all the steps along the way are met with sufficient time and sufficient input, so that when you do get to finally launching a new name, it has gone through all the necessary procedures. So those were 4 case studies. I'm going to ask just one more question, and that is, does naming architecture save money? And I know, we're all interested in having quantified proof of cost savings, and that's hard to quantify, but easy to rationalize. You have to believe that when you simplify the internal processes and you reduce the number of unnecessary trademarks within an organization, there are going to be cost savings over time. So our firm belief is that naming architecture does save money, as well as being a much more effective way to communicate a complex portfolio to a vast marketplace. So the final takeaways. Intent is easy, follow through is hard. So an organization can have the energy to do a naming architecture assignment, but it's not only important to undertake the effort, but also to keep it usable throughout the years. Senior level commitment is essential in this regard, to launch it within the organization and to make sure that it's ongoing. Third point, guidelines that are too rigid will fail. So I know I've been putting some heavy emphasis on the use of descriptive, versus evocative names, but the reality is there needs to be a strategic balance between the two for most organizations. And lastly, does it save money? We believe it does. So we'll turn it over now for questions, which I believe you can enter for us to answer. We'd be glad to look at these.
Great. Thanks very much, Jeff. That's right. You can enter your questions right through the portal right there. So please go ahead and take a moment to do that now, and then we'll start answering those. Jeff, you've taken us through some really great examples with Aetna, Moto, Vanguard, Sloan Kettering. I think that one of the things that I was talking to a client this morning, and they said, if we've already been through a rebranding, is it too late for us to start reorganizing, the product portfolio if we already have guidelines already in place? Do you get that question? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that gets back to the very beginning of this discussion, is that there's somewhat of a difference between a rebranding program and what you need to do with name simplification. So I don't think that it's too late. It's important that the distinction is made so that, if at the outset of the program it is going to involve all elements of brand development and name simplification, that's fine. But if the branding program at the outset was more focused on what's the key message of the organization, what is the identity, what's the visual identity, and elements like that, it's certainly not too late to turn to naming architecture afterwards.
Okay, that's great. We'll just give another moment. Again, if you have questions, I see one coming through. Okay, great. Let's see. The question here is, can you comment on trade-offs between incorporating sponsor names and names becoming increasingly unwieldy, such as MSK, or in the stadium world, Sports Authority Field at Mile High? Sponsorship is an area where business leaders have to make trade-offs between dollars of brand clarity, and we wonder what your thoughts are there.
Okay, that's a challenging question. And yes, we've come across the conflict between trying to create names that are simple and names that have a lot of elements, and they become unwieldy when you try to put them all together. Mm-hmm. So there is this trade-off, there is this balance, and that's why you need to think strategic about what kind of name is going to work best, in your case, in a field setting, versus being absolutely clear. We are facing that exact challenge now with one of our clients, where acronyms work well for them because the names can get so unwieldy when you try to get descriptive. But sometimes just looking at it a little bit more carefully may enable you to create a descriptive name that gets away from complexity and acronyms and things that aren't readily understandable. But I can understand when you're talking about the Sports Authority Field, how many elements can you actually put in a name in that specific setting? It also comes to mind, it may depend on what the setting is, because names don't live in a vacuum. So, depending on where it appears, you may be able to have more elements in one of the communications versus the sign itself. Mm-hmm. I hope that's helpful.
Great. Terrific. Thanks so much. So we'll, again, give everybody a chance to enter in questions. One of the things that I was thinking, Jeff, as we were getting ready for this, is there, for folks that are maybe thinking about this, is there a particularly good place to start identifying their current company's current architecture challenges? For example, a company of financial services that offers many different products to different types of customers. Where are good places that you suggest people start?
Yeah, a lot of our assignments involve really looking at the company as a whole, and then determining the different audience segments. It could be a specific product portfolio. So I could be looking at how the company deals with its consumer offerings. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the case with CVS. They're really very discrete areas, and given that CVS Pharmacy is really at the retail core of the company, a lot of the effort around naming architecture is how do we make things clear on the shelf, or in the walking through a retail environment, versus the business or PBM environment. But ideally, there would be an opportunity to look at company as a whole, and then just take it segment by segment and figuring out what's the best strategy for each. It comes back to the point that likely a business customer is going to have different needs or different expectations than a retail customer. So that if I'm looking at naming architecture in a retail setting, there are certain visible needs, shelf needs, that aren't the same as when I'm trying to provide a complex technology solution to a business customer. And this dictates not only how you organize the offerings, but what kinds of names you attach to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, thank you for all of these different examples. We're going to give folks just another minute, just in case they want to submit another question. And as always, this has been recorded, so those of you who are on the line, you'll get a recording, and you can review that to listen to different aspects of Jeff's talk in greater detail, or share that with colleagues who you know are facing these questions and thinking about these topics. Just give them a second. I think we're probably good with the web questions, so why don't we just go ahead